Okay, so it's 4th of July here, and one of our favorite things to do during 4th of July is it's pie baking time. And there's fresh berries available, and it's a perfect time to bake a pie. And we're actually going to use today bear lard, which is really hard to come by if you don't know someone that hunts. But thankfully, my husband hunts and rendered this bear lard. And if you'd like to know how that's done, there will be a link to that video in the description that you can find below. But bear lard, you can see here, it's beautiful. It's perfectly white, and there's no off color or off flavor. And historically, bear lard was really known for being one of the most excellent sources of fat, particularly for pastries, and is still considered to be so. It's just very difficult to find. The kind of lards you'd find in the grocery store are mostly rendered from pork. And I don't know about you, but the extra hydrogenation and some of the off flavors really make it undesirable. So bear lard is one of the best sources of fat, and we're pretty excited that we have homemade rendered bear lard to make this beautiful blackberry black bear pie. So the recipes that we use today are adaptations from some of my favorite cookbooks and websites for food related recipes. And this cookbook is from Cooks Illustrated, and it's provided by the America's Test Kitchen. And this is where we got our pie crust recipe. And epicurious.com is where we got our blackberry pie filling recipe. So the first step to making this bear lard pie crust is to quickly blend up your dry ingredients, which is your 1.5 cups of flour. Next is 2 tablespoons of sugar. And then lastly is 1 teaspoon of salt. And you just put the lid on and you just quickly puree those for a couple of pulses. Like that. Then the next thing that the recipe says is to sprinkle your fat over the top of your flour, and then use your food processor and puree. And you puree it until it's really finely granulated and it starts to actually turn into a big clumpy ball. So first we'll start with our bear lard, which is 1/2 cup of bear lard that's been frozen, and it's in a lot of different small little chunks, so that will puree really nicely. And then lastly is the butter, which is 12 tablespoons of butter cut into 1/4 inch pieces. And you're supposed to sprinkle these over the flour mixture. Process this for about 15 seconds until it starts to form uneven clumps. So what we can see here is that all the fat has been evenly distributed among the flour mixture, and it's fairly uneven. Scrape down the bowl and to kind of even it out a little bit. And then you actually add another cup of flour to the food processor and then process again. And sprinkle that evenly. Take your flour and fat mixture and turn it out into a large bowl. So the next step in this recipe is to sprinkle the cold liquid over the fat flour mixture, and in this recipe it's 1/4 cup ice water and 1/4 cup iced vodka, which we actually just keep in the freezer. So let me just sprinkle it over the top. And get your vodka. And do the same thing. Now the value of using vodka is that it has a very low moisture content, and the idea is that you then get a more tender, flaky crust because there's less gluten formation.
Perfect.
Then you take a stiff spatula and mix it all together. This dough will actually be quite soft. You can see here it's starting to want to form a clump, and essentially you just mix it until it forms a clump. You take about half of the dough and you place it in plastic wrap. You just wrap it up. And one of kind of the easier things is to sort of prep it for rolling by pressing it out into sort of a flattened disc. And you do that with the second half of the dough. And this recipe is for making a 2-crust pie. You place these 2 pie doughs in the refrigerator for at least 1 hour, or you can actually place it straight into the freezer if you're not going to use it right away, but you just want to make sure you give it some time to come to temperature before you go to roll it out. And in about an hour we'll be able to make a delicious blackberry black bear pie. Okay, so it's been several hours and we've had the opportunity to go out in the backyard with our boys and pick some beautiful blackberries. And so now we're ready to mix up our blackberry filling, and so I'm going to let you know what goes into that. So to start with, we have approximately 6 cups of fresh picked blackberries, 1 cup of sugar, a 1/4 cup of cornstarch, 1 tablespoon of quick cooking tapioca, 2 tablespoons of melted butter, 1 small lemon and its juice, so about 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, and then 2 tablespoons of water. So essentially what you do is you just put everything in the bowl and mix it together and then let it kind of steep together for about 20 minutes while you're prepping your pie dough. So first you take your blackberries, pour them in the bowl. Lots of hard work into those blackberries. And we've got our sugar, cornstarch, and this recipe is kind of interesting because it uses 2 different kinds of thickeners, so the cornstarch as well as the quick cooking tapioca. And then it has 2 tablespoons of butter, which butter makes everything better. And then the lemon. I really like lemon with blackberry. It's a really wonderful flavor. And then we have our 2 tablespoons of water. It's important to have a little bit of moisture in here with the berries. As you can see, it's coming together quite nicely. And when you bake it, it will set up and you'll have a filling that's really nicely set up when you slice your pie.
Awesome.
All right, and we'll just set this aside for about 20 minutes. So we pulled our pie crust out of the refrigerator and kind of let it come up to temperature for about 15 minutes. And right now I'm going to roll out our bottom crust. And as I mentioned previously, this dough is really soft and it might take a fair bit of flour actually to roll it out. But actually, because you haven't used very much flour, excessive flour in the recipe, your pie dough will still be really tender. So you start with a fair bit of flour on your work surface here. You pull it out of your plastic. And again, it's nice that it's approximately the shape that you want it to be. And you heavily flour your rolling pin as well as your dough. And I like to turn my dough as I work with it for a couple of reasons. One, it helps the dough form a circle, but also it ensures that it's not sticking to your work surface, because that's about as sad as can be when you have rolled out a beautiful pie crust and then you can't get it off your work surface. As you can see here, it's kind of working from the center out and making 1/4 turns as you go. If it starts to stick a little bit, you can just add a little bit of flour underneath your pie dough. And I just tend to do it just for good measure. And again, you're kind of working from the center as you go. You're really just trying to maintain that circle shape. And then if you're not sure if you've rolled it out enough, you can just hold your pie plate over your dough. And if you have several inches on either side, that's plenty of room. So next what we'll do, and this is the part where you start to get a little bit nervous, is you actually have to pick up your dough and place it in your pie plate. So first what you do is you just kind of pick up your edges and fold it over in half and move your pie plate pretty close because you don't want to have to go very far. And you just place it in your pie plate and then gently fold it over. And then the next step is just to kind of gently press down the edges so that there aren't any wide gaps from the edge of the pie plate to the pie dough. And sometimes your dough will tear a little bit, and you can just easily kind of press that back together. So the recipe says to refrigerate the dough while you prepare the top crust. So that's what we'll do. So next up we're going to roll out our top crust. And there's lots of different ways to make a top crust. You can make a lattice, you can do lots of beautiful designs, but our kids love the crust. So we like to keep as much crust as possible because that's their favorite part. So again, you just heavily flour with this recipe and just start rolling out again. So you want to roll it out to about that 1/8 inch thickness. So we've rolled out both crusts, and now it's time to prep everything and get everything put together. So one of the things that you want to do is you want to make sure that there's not that much overhang, probably just about a 1/2 inch of overhang. And actually our kids absolutely love this part. We throw these on a baking sheet and sprinkle them with cinnamon sugar, and it's their favorite. So don't throw this away, especially if you have little kids. But you just don't want to have too much, because it makes, one, it would make the crust uneven, but it would make it also very thick on the edge. Take your berries and you'll load them into your pie shell. And you can see by this time they've really started releasing some of their juices and everything's really coming together. And next we're going to place the top crust, and it's a similar process. You just fold your top crust in half. And I like to move my dough on my pie plate awfully close just so I don't have to go very far. And you'll place it halfway and then fold your other half across. And you can see here, it's beautiful. So again, I'll just go around and kind of trim it a little bit. So, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but just about like that. So then what you'll do is you'll actually start rolling it under. And you can see here now, this is why I trimmed off all that excess dough. If I was rolling over a huge piece of dough under there, you would have an extremely thick, and it would be really hard to cook through and not ideal. So then I just like to do a really simple little crimp. I've known people that like to use other different kinds of fluting methods. You can get as creative as you like, but really it's just, the purpose is just to crimp it together so that your filling doesn't go out into your oven. So we have our egg wash. We'll just brush it over. And the egg wash just really helps the sanding sugar to stick, but it also promotes a really pretty color as well as a shine. And we'll get our sanding sugar, which is just essentially coarse sugar, and we'll sprinkle a healthy amount over the top, because who doesn't love a little bit of sugar? Okay, so we've got our sanding sugar, and then we'll take a knife, and like I said, you could actually use a cutter and actually cut out some beautiful designs, but I just like to do something simple, which is really just cut some slits, kind of the classic storybook pie. And now the steam can escape while it bakes. So now that you've spent all this time making this beautiful dough, it's pretty important that it doesn't get totally singed in the oven. And you can buy pie rings that cover the edge so that the edge crust doesn't get burned. But I've always found that sometimes they stick and they can kind of cause problems, and sometimes they're not exactly the right size. So I just use foil. I just take thin pieces of foil and kind of carefully crimp them on the edge. And you would just put this, you would keep the foil on for really probably about the first 45 minutes, 35 to 45 minutes of baking, and then pull it off so that it can evenly brown at the end. But this just really keeps it from burning. We've preheated our oven to 400 degrees, and you can see we placed a baking sheet in here. And the reason for that, there's two reasons. One is to collect the excess drips when you bake the pie, but also it helps to really brown the bottom of your pie. You can see these foil strips tend to be a little bit cantankerous, but you just put them on there and then gently put them back on. Close the door. And we'll want to check this pie after about 45 minutes, and at that point we'll make sure it's browning evenly and remove the foil and probably bake it for another 15. So I removed the foil at about 45 minutes of baking and then continued baking for about another 20 minutes. So a little over an hour until the juices were starting to bubble out the steam vents. And so we'll just let it cool and then take it to the party that we're going to this evening.
My mommy makes the best pie ever.
Sorry.
Delicious.